Have you ever just, stopped and really wondered about how everything around us, well, became? Or even why we're here at all?
Mm-hmm. Those are the big ones, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Because at some point, we all find ourselves grappling with those really profound questions about creation and purpose and, well, the nature of the divine.
It's a fundamental human thing, that curiosity.
Yeah,
About our origins, about what's beyond what we can immediately see. It seems to pop up everywhere, across time and cultures.
absolutely. And today, on the deep dive, we're not just like dipping our toes in, we're taking a full plunge. And our guide for this is a really comprehensive work, Shining Pearls of Faith by Mohammad Abu AbdurRahman.
Ah, yes, the significant text.
Right. And it's interesting because it's not just laying out theological concepts. It actually presents clear, rational proofs for God's existence, oneness, and perfection. Think of it as a kind of logical roadmap, maybe, for understanding these ancient but always relevant questions.
It is compelling, I think, because it doesn't just state beliefs. It tries to build a logical framework, really inviting you to engage intellectually with these huge subjects.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission today is to unpack these arguments, kind of explore their logic, and see how they connect to things we can actually observe, in the world around us, maybe even inside ourselves.
Looking for those connections.
We're looking for those aha moments, right? The ones that bring a fresh perspective to maybe some timeless wisdom. We'll try to navigate these complex ideas with stories and analogies so you walk away feeling, hopefully, well-informed, but not totally overwhelmed.
And maybe spark some more curiosity along the way.
That's the goal. So let's start where the source begins. This idea about our innate human capacity for belief.
Okay.
So Shining Pearls of Faith opens with this really fascinating idea that people are essentially born with a kind of readiness, an innate readiness, to accept and worship God. It suggests there's something almost, hardwired in us.
Like a default setting.
Kind of. A natural inclination, rather than something we have to be taught completely from scratch. The text says God has planted in human beings a recognition of his sovereignty, oneness, and perfection. That this provides a foundation for belief and action.
That's quite a statement. It goes against the idea that belief is purely learned, doesn't it?
It really does.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is how the source outlines this kind of dual path. So on one hand, you've got this innate recognition, like a spiritual intuition almost, an innocent nature, it calls it.
Right.
And for many people, maybe initially, this feeling is pure enough that, well, rational arguments aren't even really necessary.
I don't know.
Or feel it.
Perhaps. But then the text acknowledges that, life happens, harmful influences can corrupt this original state, and if that happens, that's when reason becomes the crucial pathway to come back to the right conclusions.
So it's like having a primary navigation system, the intuitive one, and then a backup, the critical thinking one. That's a good way to put it, yeah. A backup that kicks in if the first one gets sort of jammed or obscured. And the source points out that the Quran itself provides these clear, rational proofs, often telling people to look around and within themselves for the evidence.
So it's not just about blind faith then. Our intellect, our reason, has a really important role, especially if that innate sense gets clouded over time.
Exactly. It gives reason a noble purpose, in a way.
Right.
And speaking of challenges, the source makes a very direct point about something common today. It insists that scientific inquiry, lab work and experiments is not necessary to find God.
Really. That's counter to how a lot of people think now.
It is. It states that God's existence ought to be innate and known without the least inference. And even if that innate sense isn't strong anymore, one only needs to reflect over the fact of creation and to think deeply about the arguments revealed in Scripture.
So you don't need a PhD or a lab coat to start thinking about this stuff.
That's the message. The profound truths are accessible through, well, observation and reflection, looking and thinking.
That simplifies things quite a bit, actually. It means this journey of understanding doesn't necessarily start with complex experiments, but with something much closer to our everyday experience, observation and reflection.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, if we accept this idea, this potential for an innate connection, how does the physical world, the whole fact of creation itself, either affirm or maybe challenge that inner knowing?
That's the next logical step the source takes us on. It moves right into the fact of creation. And it argues that we see creation happening not just as some single grand beginning, billions of years ago.
Like the Big Bang only.
Right, not only that, but constantly. Through things coming into existence and others going out of existence, it points to passages in the Quran that basically challenge us, asking, were you created by nothing? Did you create yourselves? Did you create the heavens and the earth? The implication being, no, you're not certain, are
That's a fundamental argument then.
Hmm?
Things don't just pop into existence from nothing, and they don't create themselves.
Yeah. Precisely. They require an external creator, something outside the system.
Okay, that follows logically. But, I often hear people say, well, nothing truly new is ever created. It's all just rearrangement, like cosmic Lego bricks just getting clicked together in different ways. Is creation really just a fancy word for rearrangement?
That is a very common point, and it's exactly what the source tackles head on. It says many people assume creation only means bringing something into existence out of nothing. The Latin ex nihilo.
Right, from absolute emptiness.
Yeah. And since we don't generally see things just appearing out of a total void in our daily lives.
Like a rabbit out of a hat, but without the hat or the rabbit beforehand.
Exactly. Since we don't see that, people tend to discount everything else as just shuffling existing matter around, and then they might deny creation altogether in the sense of something genuinely new originating.
So the source is saying that definition, ex nihilo only, is too narrow. What's the broader understanding it presents?
It clarifies that the Quran's general meaning of creation is, and this is key, to bring something into existence after its non-existence out of something else that ceases to exist.
Okay, wait. Out of something else that ceases to exist. That's different.
It is. It's a crucial distinction. It broadens our understanding of divine creative action beyond just the out-of-nothing scenario. The source even gives the example that, according to Scripture, heaven and earth were created out of another created thing, namely the water beneath the throne of God.
So even the heavens and earth had an origin, something before them.
According to this view, yes, it signifies that even these huge foundational things aren't eternal in themselves. They began to exist. They originated from something else that was also created, and that prior thing ceased to exist in its original form to give rise to them.
Huh. So it emphasizes a continuous dynamic transformation guided by a creator, rather than only a single isolated act from absolute nothingness.
That's the idea, a constant bringing into existence from other things that pass away.
That's a really profound shift in thinking. It's not just rearranging the Legos, but like the Legos themselves fundamentally transforming, where one thing literally stops being what it was and something entirely new emerges from it.
Yes, that's a better analogy.
Can you give an example where something genuinely seems to cease existing in its old form and a new, fundamentally different thing comes into being?
Absolutely. The source is very clear on this. While composite things do rearrange, building a house from bricks, that's rearrangement.
Sure.
Creation also involves things perishing and originating completely different things out of them. The change can be in the very substance, not just the arrangement or form.
Substance itself changes.
Right. It clarifies that only composite things rearrange, but the basic building blocks, the constituent parts, when they are overpowered by appropriate means, they are observed totally changing into things of a different nature. They actually cease to exist as what they were, and other things begin to exist in their place.
So it's not like the bricks are just rebuilt into a different shape. It's like the plastic of the brick itself is turned into wood or something completely different.
Exactly. That captures the essence of it, and the text offers a compelling example from the Quran, which details human embryonic development. It describes the process, how a sperm drop becomes a clinging clot, the clot becomes a lump of flesh, the lump forms bones, the bones are covered with flesh, and then it says, we developed him into another creation.
Another creation. That phrase stands out.
It does. It suggests it's not just growth or rearrangement, but a profound transformation at each stage, where one thing ceases to be and a new, different reality emerges. The source even notes that modern science accepts that matter is both created and annihilated.
That's a surprising connection to physics. Are there specific scientific examples mentioned?
Yes, it highlights the example of an electron and a positron annihilating each other.
Okay, matter and antimatter.
Right. When they interact, they don't just break apart or rearrange, they totally change into energy, usually photons, light. This isn't rearrangement because energy, in that context, isn't made of particles in the same way the electron and positron were. the matter itself totally changed into energy. It ceased to exist as matter.
Wow, okay. So that really illustrates how something can genuinely cease to exist in one form and give rise to something fundamentally different. It shows a continuous creative power.
Precisely, a testament to ongoing creative agency.
So there's this profound creative power at work, way beyond just simple assembly. But why then, from the perspective of shining pearls of faith, does God often create things this way from something else rather than always using the ex nihilo method? Is there a deeper wisdom there?
The source suggests there is, and it connects directly to understanding God's perfection and power. It refers to the scholar Ibn Taymiyya, who pointed out that creating one thing out of another is actually, perhaps counterintuitively, more indicative of God's power over all things.
More indicative. How so?
Well, he argued that bringing a thing out of its opposite is more astonishing than creating it ex nihilo. Think about, say, life emerging from dead earth, or, as the source mentions, fire from green trees. These transformations, which seem to defy the nature of the original thing, demonstrate a more profound, comprehensive kind of power. A power over existing substances, not just over nothingness.
That's a really interesting angle. It makes the act of creation feel even more wondrous, not less. It highlights a power that can masterfully transform existing things into entirely new substances.
Exactly. And this type of creative agency is described as being closer to the perfection of God because it serves to emphasize that only God exists without any origin whatsoever.
Ah, I see.
The text says, if all creatures are created out of origins, they will be farther away from being equal to their Lord, as it will only be God who exists without an origin. It constantly reinforces God's unique, uncreated nature. This is clearly affirmed in Quranic teachings about God being one, the eternal refuge, who neither begets nor is begotten and has no equivalent.
So, creating from something else highlights the createdness of everything besides God, reinforcing his unique status as the uncreated originator.
Precisely. It makes a distinction even clearer.
Okay, so beyond the sheer fact of creation, whether ex nihilo or from something else, the source moves into the idea of design. It argues that God's existence isn't just known because things exist, but because they seem to be designed and made into wondrous arrangements.
Intricacy and function.
Right. It's not just that things are, but that they are made intricate, beautiful, and with many different functions. This shifts the focus from the what of creation to the how and why of its structure, doesn't it?
It does. And the text then zooms in on three really major signs of God, things that are universally accessible no matter where or when you live, signs we interact with literally every day, highlighting their apparent functions.
Okay, let's look at those. First up, the night and the day. The source refers to Quranic verses that ask us to consider, what if night was continuous, or day? Who else could bring the alternation? It points out that God made night for rest and day for seeking sustenance out of his mercy.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture, it suggests this isn't just a random physical cycle. It's presented as a system specifically tailored for human well-being and purpose.
Tailored.
Yeah. The night and day aren't just accidental, they're provided in a convenient time period, and this crucial alternation allows for distinct functions, rest and activity. It's framed not just as physics, but as a divinely orchestrated rhythm that makes human life and work possible. Imagine if it was just perpetual twilight or endless noon. This balance seems purposeful.
That's a powerful thought, that the basic 24-hour cycle isn't just planetary mechanics, but maybe a sign of care designed for our benefit. What about the moon? What does shining pearls of faith draw from our lunar neighbor?
The moon is highlighted, referencing the Quran, as being made a light with determined phases, specifically so that you may know the number of years and account of time.
The calendar function.
Exactly. The source emphasizes its role as a natural calendar. Its reliable, fixed cycle makes it easy to calculate months and years. Think about it. Before modern clocks and digital calendars, this celestial body was this essential, universal way of tracking time, crucial for agriculture, for trade, even for religious observances.
It's easy to forget how vital that must have been. Which brings us to the stars. You mentioned them as the third sign. Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Imagine a world without those stars as guides for our ancestors. How different would human history, navigation, exploration, maybe even early societies have been?
That's a fantastic point, and it's precisely why the stars are listed as such a significant sign. Without them, early human travel, especially long-distance trade across vast lands and seas, would have been incredibly difficult, maybe almost impossible in many cases.
Just getting lost constantly.
Pretty much. The stars provide clear navigation, as the source puts it, through the darknesses of the land and sea. It references Quranic verses about God placing the stars for guidance. These aren't just pretty lights, they are presented as functional, purposeful beacons that literally guided people across oceans and deserts for millennia.
So, reflecting on the sheer usefulness of these things, the day-night cycle, the moon's phases, the stars for navigation, leads to a pretty strong conclusion about our place in it all.
It does. The source concludes that realizing these functions helps us understand that human beings are greatly privileged and have been blessed by an all-powerful creator. It points to Quranic verses stating God has honored the children of Adam and made things in the heavens and earth subject to us, bestowing favors both apparent and hidden.
So it's like finding purpose and care embedded right into the structure of the cosmos.
That's the perspective offered, yes, a constant reminder of divine attention and honor.
This idea of inherent functionality and being provided for leads us nicely into the next major theme: creation's continuous dependence on God. It's not just about things being made once, is it? But about their ongoing existence.
That's right. The core idea here is that all created things remain contingent and dependent on their creator. They do not exist independently after they are created. In essence, they owe their very existence, moment by moment, to the one who made them.
So not like a watchmaker who makes a watch, winds it up, and then it just runs on its own.
Exactly the opposite of that, according to this view. And this raises a really important question. It's not just that God created things once, but that he is continuously sustaining them. The source cites a Quranic verse stating, "Indeed, God holds the heavens and the earth lest they cease. And if they should cease, no one could hold them in place after him."
Wow, lest they cease. That implies they would cease without his holding them.
That's the implication. It means God is necessary and sufficient for the origination and existence of this world. He's portrayed as a king who is constantly, actively controlling and maintaining his creation, a truly involved creator, not a distant, passive observer. This continuous dependence means nothing, big or small, truly exists or happens independently of his sustaining power and decree.
Oh, but how does this square with natural causes? I mean, science is built on understanding cause and effect. Gravity pulls things down, rain makes plants grow. Does this idea of constant dependence mean those natural laws are somehow not real or irrelevant?
No, not at all. The source is careful to clarify that God's unrestricted control of all things does not contradict the existence of natural causes. Natural causes are real. They do act and produce effects. However,
Where's a but?
there's a but. They don't do so truly independently. They function only by the will of God. The idea is that God creates the causes and their effects and makes one thing a cause for another.
So God creates the rain and the seed and the soil and the property of the rain causing the seed and the soil to grow.
Exactly. Using the source's example, God creates trees by means of rain, earth, and sunlight. Those natural causes are viewed as instruments of his will, the means through which he acts, rather than being completely independent agents. Think of it maybe like God being the ultimate programmer of the universe, and natural laws are the code he wrote and actively runs and maintains.
That makes a lot of sense. It frames natural laws as part of the divine design and ongoing action, not as forces separate from or opposed to it. And I guess this understanding of constant divine agency must extend to what we usually call miracles.
Precisely. The core idea presented is that all events ultimately result from God's creative agency, whether they happen with or without apparent natural causes, and because God is the one who established the natural causes and their effects in the first place.
He can also suspend them or bypass them.
Right. He is also able to remove the ability of a natural cause to produce its effect. Examples given range from the grand scale, the creation of heavens and earth, living things, to the more personal, like answering prayers, guiding the course of history, or sending revelation. The Quran is quoted saying, "Whoever is within the heavens and the earth asks him. Every day he is bringing about a matter." It emphasizes an active, dynamic, moment-to-moment relationship with creation.
It's quite staggering to think about that level of continuous dependence and involvement. But what kind of being would possess such constant, all-encompassing power and sustain everything? This must lead us to think about the nature of the Creator himself.
Indeed. And that's where Shining Pearls of Faith delves into the attributes that define what it calls the perfection of God.
Okay. How does it approach describing something so ultimate?
It starts with a very simple, relatable observation. Imagine, the source says, someone offered you an apple tart but said it had no size, no color, no form, no texture.
You'd think they were joking.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. An apple tart has to have properties.
Exactly. Or imagine describing a friend who was, say, faceless and had no hands. It's nonsensical because it's rationally impossible for any object to exist without properties and attributes.
Things have qualities. That's what makes them things.
Right, so the application is direct. If even created things require attributes to exist, then God, who the argument posits has more right to existence than we do, must be more deserving of attributes than we are. This sets the stage for understanding God not just as having attributes, but as being maximally perfect.
Maximally perfect by necessity. What does that phrase really mean here? And thinking about all these perfections together, is there like one big, maybe revolutionary idea about God that emerges from that?
Maximally perfect by necessity means that God possesses the best names and his attributes are of the highest possible perfection, beauty, and majesty. Think of attributes like powerful, knowing, hearing. Seeing these aren't just incidental qualities, they necessarily describe his essence. The philosophical argument presented is that any conceivable perfection that doesn't imply a deficiency must belong to God. If he lacked some possible perfection, he would then be in need of another more perfect being to gain that perfection, which creates a contradiction. He wouldn't be the ultimate self-sufficient creator.
Okay, so he can't lack any possible perfection.
Right. And the really big, perhaps revolutionary idea flowing from this is that there must exist a maximally perfect being who is inherently complete, totally self-sufficient, needing absolutely nothing for his own existence, and who is the ultimate source of all perfection found in others. That being is God.
Let's maybe touch on a few of these foundational attributes mentioned. First, God's power. Seems obvious, but how is it framed?
Well, the creator, just by definition, must possess great power, power over all things, and critically, nothing overpowers him. It's presented as a rational necessity. If anything could overpower him, he wouldn't be the ultimate source, would he?
No, he'd be secondary. Makes sense. And his will.
God must have a will because he created the world at a specific point in time and continues to create one thing after another. Without will, the argument goes, nothing would begin nor continue to occur. Things wouldn't happen. The universe wouldn't unfold sequentially. It would either be static or maybe just not the ordered, developing system we observe moving from moment to moment.
Right. Things happen now and then now, implying a directing force choosing for them to happen.
Precisely. And linked to that is God's knowledge. The Quran asks rhetorically, does he who created not know?
Implying, of course, he knows what he created.
Yes. An intentional creator must conceive of what he creates. But it goes further. Creating things with functional structures of great complexity and detail, like, say, human eyes or brains, necessitates extreme knowledge. God's knowledge is described as perfect knowledge, meaning he knows all things that happened and will happen and how those things that did not happen could have happened.
Wow. Past, present, future, and hypotheticals.
That's the implication, a totally comprehensive awareness that's really beyond our human capacity to fully grasp.
And for a being with such knowledge and intentions, well, life itself seems like a necessary attribute, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The source states simply, one with knowledge and intentions is living. Therefore, God is the ever-living, the ultimate source of all life. And logically, it argues, God has more right to having life than the living things he created.
So this connects to God's eternality having no beginning and no end. That idea of God being first without beginning and last without end really shifts our whole understanding of time itself, doesn't it? It's not just that he existed before time, but maybe that he is the very origin or ground of existence's temporal aspect.
It absolutely does reframe it.
Yeah.
God necessarily exists and does not perish. He is the first without beginning and the last without end. This underscores his ultimate independence. He isn't contingent on anything else. He's fundamentally distinct from anything created, which by definition has a beginning and is subject to ending or changing. It removes any possibility of him depending on anything.
And this absolute independence and perfection leads directly to the attribute of God's oneness, right?
Indeed. The source states God is one and only. The evidence cited includes his independent nature, which we just discussed, the perceived great order in the world, and the interdependence of all its parts pointing to a single designer or sustainer. It mentions Quranic challenges to polytheism, basically asking proponents to show what their supposed partners have actually created, highlighting the lack of any evidence for another true creator.
Okay. Now, Shining Pearls of Faith goes into detail on other crucial attributes like God's sight, hearing, and speech. Rather than maybe listing every single one, what's the key takeaway about these? How are they presented as different from, say, our sight or hearing?
That's a good question. The core principle of pride is consistency with perfection. the giver of sight and hearing, may not be deaf or blind, but rather has more right to perfection than his creatures do.
So, if he gives the faculty, he must possess it in a more perfect way.
That's the argument. Therefore, God sees and hears all things, but in a way that is perfect, all-encompassing, and without the limitations we experience. It's about perfect awareness. Similarly, the creator of beings who speak cannot be mute, but possesses speech in the most perfect way, communicating his will, for instance, through revelation to prophets. They aren't human-like senses or abilities, but perfect, comprehensive, divine realities reflecting his complete knowledge and interaction with all creation.
So this whole picture of a single, unique being possessing all these perfect attributes inherently, that naturally leads to the argument for why there can only be one such being.
Exactly. If God is maximally perfect, eternal, independent, all-powerful, all-knowing, etc., then the idea of having two such beings immediately runs into logical problems.
Right. We've covered these profound attributes defining God's perfection. Now let's really dig into why, logically, according to this source, there can only be one such being. The text explicitly addresses the oneness of God, saying the impossibility of multiple gods is known not only from revelation, it is also known through reason. It references specific Quranic arguments.
And this really raises that crucial question. If we even try to imagine multiple creators, does the very concept of lordship, absolute sovereignty, and power even remain coherent? A true lord, as we discussed, is defined as being necessary and sufficient for the origination and existence of this world, constantly sustaining it. If you introduce a second one, well, things get complicated fast.
Because lordship seems to require independent power, right? That instantly sets a really high bar. What's the immediate logical problem if we try to picture multiple beings meeting that standard of absolute independence?
That's the crux. Remember, nothing occurs without God's will. His eternal and independent nature means his power may not be gained, removed, or changed by another. He is powerful on his own, not needing assistance or being subject to restriction. If you try to posit multiple lords, each would theoretically need the same kind of independent, unrestricted power over creation. And that's where the logical contradictions start piling up.
Okay, the source presents several arguments against multiple gods. Let's break down the first one. Each deity would take what he created. Can you unpack that? And what's the immediate sort of observational challenge to that scenario in our world?
Right. So the argument goes like this. If we assume, just for argument's sake, that two truly independent lords exist, then each one must be totally sufficient for his own creation and, crucially, not need the other.
Okay, self-contained.
Yes. And from this, it logically follows that neither one of the two lords should change the created effects of the other. Because, think about it, if one lord could interfere with or change what the other lord created or decreed, it would imply the first lord could alter the second lord's power or decisions. But that's impossible if the second lord is truly eternally powerful and independent, right?
Right, you can't be independent and someone else can just override your work.
Exactly. So the logical consequence is that each should take what he created. Their domains, their creations, would have to be completely distinct and non-interfering.
Like two separate universes, maybe.
Perhaps. But the immediate observational challenge is, as the source puts it, this distinction in creation is nowhere to be seen. What we actually observe is a world where all the parts function together in great order and constantly influence each other. You know, the sun affects the earth, which affects plants, which affect animals. Clouds affect rainfall, which affects rivers. It's all interconnected.
A single unified system.
Precisely. The source argues this interdependence proves that the God who created the earth is the same one who created the sun, and so on. If there were truly two or more distinct independent lords, their creations would logically have to be separate and non-interacting, which is clearly not the reality we experience. The whole ecosystem, the laws of physics applying everywhere, it all points to a single, unified origin and sustainer.
That's a very strong point based on observation. The seamless interconnectedness argues against multiple separate authors. What's the second argument against multiple deities?
The second argument is also quite profound. Some would overcome others. The core idea here is that two equally powerful lords cannot possibly exist when it comes to acting in the same domain, i.e. creation.
Why not? Why can't you have two equally powerful forces?
Because if one lord is independently able to cause a certain effect, say, make object X move, the other lord cannot simultaneously cause that same effect, or its opposite, make object X stay still, without restricting the first lord's ability to act independently. The power of one over creation restricts the power of the other. If they both try to act on the same thing at the same time with different intentions, their powers conflict.
Okay, so their supposed equal power becomes a source of mutual limitation.
Exactly. And how does that principle, the impossibility of two truly equal and independent forces coexisting in the same active domain, play out elsewhere? Maybe even in physics or social structures. Are there echoes of that?
That's an interesting parallel to consider. In nature, you often see hierarchies of force, don't you?
Yeah.
Or dynamics where one force eventually dominates or sets the conditions for others.
Right. The source uses the analogy that it is impossible for two equal kings to govern a kingdom effectively and independently. One can only be truly powerful and sovereign if the second is ultimately powerless or subordinate in that specific domain. Therefore, a true lord, by definition of having unrestricted power, will have no equal and will overpower others. Any being whose power could be restricted or overcome wouldn't fit the definition of a true lord. They'd be a lesser dependent creature, not a co-equal god.
So the Quranic phrase interpreted here, some of them would overcome others, isn't predicting a celestial battle, but showing logically that if you had multiple contenders, only one could emerge as truly sovereign, proving the others weren't truly lords in the first place.
That's the interpretation presented. Yes, a restricted lord is not a lord at all, but is a dependent being just like us.
Okay. And the third argument hits the idea of them maybe cooperating, the impossibility of partnership.
Yes. This one argues that it is impossible for multiple lords to maintain the world in partnership. Why? Because partnership inherently implies a lack of fully independent power and agency for each partner. They have to agree, compromise, rely on each other, but this directly contradicts the essential nature of a lord who must be independent in power and agency.
Partners aren't truly independent sovereigns.
Exactly. The source uses a down-to-earth analogy. Even two cooks cooking in one pot will be impossible unless both cooks choose to go back to a third one above for directions, like a head chef. But with supposed co-equal lords, by definition, there can be no higher authority above them to appeal to or receive direction from.
Right, there's no cosmic head chef.
So the conclusion is that a partnership of multiple lords is logically impossible. It cites the Quranic verse, had there been within the heavens and earth gods besides God, they both heavens and earth would have been ruined, implying the conflict or lack of unified will would lead to chaos.
That makes sense. The need for coordination undermines the independence required for true lordship. Then there's the famous argument from opposition. This one seems to cut right to the heart of conflicting wills.
It's a classic, very direct philosophical argument. Let's assume, for argument's sake again, that two lords exist. Lord A wills a particular creature to move. Lord B simultaneously wills the exact same creature to be still. What happens?
Uh-oh. Logically, only a few possibilities, right?
Right. The analysis breaks it down.
Both wills are carried out. Impossible. The creature cannot be both moving and still at the same exact moment. It's a logical contradiction.
Okay, rule that one out.
Outcome 2. Neither will is carried out. If this happens, it means both Lord A and Lord B are powerless to enact their will over this creature. If they're powerless, they aren't lords. Plus, the creature is neither moving nor still, which is also a contradiction.
So both are powerless, and reality breaks. Rule that out too.
Which leaves outcome 3. Only one will is carried out. Either the creature moves, Lord A's will prevails, or it remains still, Lord B's will prevails. In this scenario, the one whose will is done demonstrates power, acting as the true lord in this instance. The other, whose will was thwarted, is shown to be powerless and therefore not a true lord.
So in any possible scenario involving conflict, you can't logically sustain the idea of two equally powerful, independent lords acting.
Exactly. The only logically coherent conclusion is that only one true, unopposed lord can exist. The source notes this parallels the logic used by Abraham in his argument with the king, as mentioned in the Quran.
That does seem pretty airtight logically, but I know there's an objection people raise here. What about the idea of two lords who maybe necessarily agree on everything, so they never actually disagree, avoiding the conflict scenario altogether? It's an attempt to sidestep the argument from opposition.
It's a clever theoretical objection, yes. But the source argues this idea contains more than one absurdity. The main one being that this very notion of necessary agreement actually implies a lack of true independent power, which is essential for lordship.
How so? How does necessary agreement mean lack of power?
Well, it revisits two key principles we touched on earlier. First, God's power must be independent of all others. He is powerful in and of himself. Creatures, in contrast, are powerful by another, by God enabling them. Second, circular dependency is impossible. A thing cannot cause itself, nor can it be the cause of its own cause. You can't get your power from B if B gets his power from you.
Okay, independence and no circular logic. How does that apply to the necessarily agreeing lords?
If two lords necessarily agree, it implies that each one is unable to do except what the other one allows, or wills. Their wills are locked together. This means each one is effectively powerful only by the other and not on his own. Their power is contingent on the other's agreement.
Ah, so they lose their independence. They're not powerful in and of themselves.
Exactly. But that's impossible for a true lord, who must be powerful inherently and independently. If they depend on each other for their power or the ability to exercise their will, it creates that impossible circular dependency. A can't make B powerful if A owes its own power to B. It just doesn't work logically for beings defined by self-sufficiency and independence.
So the conclusion is, if two powerful lords did exist, they must possess independent power and will, which inherently makes disagreement possible.
Yes. But since disagreement, as the argument from opposition showed, leads to logical contradictions,
Then the initial premise of two or more lords must be impossible in the first place.
that's the logical outcome presented. An existence of two or more lords is impossible. Therefore, there can only exist one God arranging the matters of the world from above.
That's a really systematic dismantling of the idea of multiple gods, and it's interesting how it relies on logical reasoning derived from the definition of God's perfection and independence. I appreciate that clarity. Now, inevitably, when discussing these deep topics, certain objections and misconceptions always pop up. Let's try to address some of the common ones based on the source material.
Okay, let's tackle.
First, a common one about impossibilities and God's power. We hear it all the time. If God is all-powerful, can he do anything? Like the classic, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it?
Yes, the paradox of the stone. It's a classic for a reason, and it raises that important question about what omnipotence really means.
Right.
The source clarifies this by stating that God's power applies to all things, but crucially, rational impossibilities are not included in those things. Why? Because they aren't really things or possibilities in the first place. They are contradictions in terms.
Like a square circle.
Exactly. Or a thing existing in two places at once, being both existent and non-existent simultaneously, or being both eternal and created. These aren't tasks that challenge power, they are just logically incoherent statements. So omnipotence, according to this view, means God can do anything that is logically possible, not that he can violate the very laws of logic.
So when atheists sometimes ask, can God create another being that is equal to himself? How does the source say Muslim scholars responded to that?
They typically viewed that question as meaningless and inherently self-contradictory.
Why self-contradictory?
Because a created being, by definition, must have a beginning, must not be independently powerful, it depends on its creator, and must not be self-sufficient. These are necessary qualities of being created. But God is defined as eternal, independently powerful, and self-sufficient. Therefore, a created being may not possibly be equal to God. The terms created and equal to God are mutually exclusive based on the definitions.
So it's not a limit on God's power, but a clarification that the request itself is illogical, like asking for a married bachelor.
Precisely. And similarly, the idea of God becoming man is presented as a rational impossibility because the attributes are seen as fundamentally incompatible. God is eternal, uncreated, self-sufficient. Humans are created, have beginnings, are needy. They represent different categories of being.
Okay. Another classic question, often used to try and, trip up the argument for a creator. If everything needs a cause or creator, then who created God? How does Shining Pearls of Faith handle that one?
It addresses this directly by stating the question itself is based on a faulty premise, a misapplication of the principle. God is not created, but is eternal and uncreated.
So the rule, everything needs a creator, applies only to things that begin to exist.
Exactly. The entire logical necessity for a creator arises precisely because originated contingent things, things that begin, things that depend on other things for their existence, require an eternal, independent, uncaused cause to explain their existence. If the proposed creator were also created, it wouldn't solve the problem. It would just become part of the chain of created things, and the whole chain would still need an ultimate external uncreated cause.
You can't have an infinite regress of creators creating creators.
An infinite regress of dependencies is deemed impossible. You need something outside the chain to start it or sustain it. Therefore, the argument concludes, the ultimate creator must logically be uncreated and distinct from the world. He is the necessary uncaused first cause.
Okay, that makes sense. What about this one? What was God doing before he created the universe? Like for all that eternity past? Was he just waiting idle?
The source tackles this by explaining that God has always been able to create things. It wasn't like he was unable to create and then suddenly gained the ability. There has never been a time when it was not possible for God to exercise his will.
So he could always create. Was he always creating then?
The view presented is that God has always been creating things by will and power and will continue to do so. It suggests that every creation is preceded by another creation. However, this is described as a regress in God's actions and effects, not a regress of causes and dependencies.
What's the difference there?
A regress of dependencies would be like the who created the creator, an infinite chain of things relying on the previous one for existence, which is seen as impossible. A regress of actions effects just means God's creative activity is eternal, always ongoing. Every particular creation is with beginning. But the act of creating itself, as an expression of God's eternal will and power, has no beginning. Only God is eternal. So the answer is he was never idle. His creative activity is continuous and eternal, even if specific creations, like our universe, have specific starting points.
This definitely implies an active God, not a static one. Does this mean God has actions in a way that implies change within him? Or is he eternally static and motionless, as some philosophical traditions might suggest?
The source strongly argues against a static view. It explicitly rejects the idea of God as eternally static and motionless, or that his actions only exist in the eternal past.
Why reject that?
Because it asserts God is ever-living and argues that life is impossible without activity. Therefore, God is neither motionless nor static. Furthermore, an active God who interacts with his creation is seen as more perfect than a static one whose actions are somehow frozen in eternity past.
So things like God becoming pleased or angry or hearing prayers or seeing deeds, these are seen as real dynamic interactions.
Yes, they are presented as aspects of his perfection. It's argued that hearing prayers when they are made or seeing deeds as they happen is more perfect than somehow only knowing them from eternity past without a present interaction. These aren't seen as changes in God's essential nature or essence, which is perfect and unchanging, but rather as dynamic expressions of his eternal attributes in relation to his creation as events unfold.
Okay, that's a key distinction, unchanging essence, but dynamic action. Now, this brings up another major point of confusion for many people. How can God exist outside of time and space, especially if he created them? My human brain immediately pictures outside as just another place, and before as just another time. It's hard to conceptualize.
It is. It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it? And the source suggests this dangerous confusion stems from an incorrect view of what space and time really are, and also from blurring the lines between God's existence and the existence of his creation.
Okay, so how does it try to solve this puzzle? What are the key distinctions it makes?
It breaks it down into several points. First, it emphasizes that only particular things exist in reality. Actual objects or attributes that exist within those objects. You can't just have redness floating around. You need a red object.
Yeah, properties belong to things.
Second, created objects have created attributes. But an uncreated entity, God, logically has uncreated attributes. His power, his sight, his knowledge are part of his eternal essence, not created qualities like ours.
Okay, uncreated God, uncreated attributes.
Third, and this is really critical for the time-space question, time and space are presented not as independent substances or containers, but as attributes or properties that subsist in the objects they describe.
Attributes. How is time an attribute?
Time, the source explains, is certainly the measure of motion of a moving object. Seconds, minutes, hours. These measures don't exist independently floating around. They relate to the movement of things, like clocks or the Earth. Days and years are properties of our Earth and Sun based on their movements. Time describes the relationship between events and motion within creation.
And space.
Similarly, space is described not as an empty container, but only a property relating to how spacious an object or area is. It's a relational concept within the created order.
So time and space aren't independent things that God has to be in or out of. They are more like descriptions of the created universe itself.
That's the core idea. God created the moving objects in which their times exist, and the spacious things that have spatial properties. Therefore, he created time and space as attributes within his creations.
Okay, so what does that mean for God himself? Is he timeless and spaceless then?
Here's the nuance. He's not timeless or spaceless in the sense of being static, inactive, or having no dimension. Remember, the source emphasizes God is ever living and has always been creating and active. His own actions and their sequence or duration are uncreated by anyone. Just like God creates our sight, but his own sight is uncreated and perfect, so too, he creates the time experienced by his creations, but his own eternal being and activity are uncreated.
So he's not subject to the created time and space of the universe, but he isn't just a dimensionless point either. He exists above creation and its temporal and spatial limitations.
That's the conclusion drawn. God is described as a tremendous being above the world and has always existed before every particular thing was created and will continue to exist after every particular thing is gone. Quranic verses about celestial bodies gliding in orbits, implying time and space for them, and God being above the throne are cited in support.
Okay, that distinction between created time-space and God's uncreated being activity is complex but crucial. It addresses the paradox somewhat. Now, for a final, maybe simpler practical objection related to space. How is God above if the Earth is round? If you point up from Australia, you're pointing down relative to someone in England, right?
It's a good common sense question based on flat Earth thinking, but the answer is simple once you think spherically.
How so?
On a round object like the Earth, there are really only two universally relevant directions relative to the object itself: an upward direction pointing away from the Earth's surface and a downward direction pointing towards its center.
Okay, away from the center or towards the center.
Right. So when a worshiper raises their hands in prayer, for instance, they naturally raise them upward, away from the Earth, towards the heavens, regardless of where they are on the globe. They don't point them down towards the Earth's core. The source humorously notes that taking the longer path downward in prayer would be unnatural and foolish.
So up is universally understood as away from the planet's surface center.
Yes, and therefore the conclusion is the throne of God must always be above the rest of the world, in this directional sense, and the God Most High is always above heaven and earth, regardless of your specific location on the sphere.
Okay, that clears up that geographical confusion. So we've journeyed through arguments for God's existence, his absolute oneness, his perfection, his continuous relationship with creation, and addressed some common logical hurdles. This brings us to perhaps the most profound question for us personally: the purpose of creation and life.
The why question.
Exactly. Shining Pearls of Faith emphasizes that God is most wise, and therefore, he does not create anything foolishly. All his actions are presented as being wise and with purpose. So, what does this imply for us? Can a reasonable person, looking at this seemingly designed universe, really conclude that we were created aimlessly?
It certainly presents a strong argument for inherent meaning, doesn't it? If the Creator is perfectly wise, then it's rational to infer that his actions, especially the creation of conscious, sentient beings like humans, must have a purpose. It wouldn't be wise to create something complex like humanity without a reason.
So how is this purpose communicated, according to the source?
The text states that this purpose was conveyed through divine guidance. God sent angels to prophets with the task of conveying that purpose, with Prophet Muhammad in the Quran being the final instance of this communication. It directly quotes a Quranic passage asking, "Did you think that we created you aimlessly and that to us you would not be returned?" It's a direct challenge to the idea of purposeless existence.
And that mention of being returned points towards the concept of resurrection and life after death, doesn't it? How does the source build the case for that? Is it just based on scripture, or is there a rational element too?
There's definitely a rational element presented alongside the scriptural one. The source calls us to reflect on two things we can observe. First, our own humble beginnings, how we develop from a seemingly insignificant sperm drop into a complex human being. And second, how God causes the earth to spring to life after it was dead and barren with rain.
Okay, the miracle of life from nothing and life returning to dead land.
Right. These are offered as observable proofs of God's power to bring life and form from seemingly lifeless or simple matter. The argument then follows. The one who created us the first time is certainly able to create us again. In fact, the Quran argues it is easier for him. It quotes verses asking, "Who will give life to bones while they are disintegrated?" with the answer being, "He will give them life who produced them the first time."
So the power demonstrated in the initial creation is evidence for the power to recreate.
Precisely. Belief in this day of judgment is presented as crucial because it's the point of accountability where we will meet God, be reminded of his blessings, and our deeds will determine our ultimate fate, either eternal bliss in the garden, paradise, or punishment in hellfire. And it's emphasized that this resurrection isn't just spiritual. It involves God literally bringing our physical bodies out of the earth and returns our souls to our recreated bodies. It's our complete selves body and soul that will be gathered.
This then leads inevitably to that very difficult but unavoidable question many people grapple with. Why does God allow or even decree adversity and suffering? This is often framed as the problem of evil by atheists who argue that suffering seems incompatible with a perfectly good and all-powerful God. How does Shining Pearls of Faith approach this?
It tackles it directly. Firstly, it considers denying God's power over all things, including evil and suffering, to be a grave mistake. It maintains that God decrees all things, good and bad. The answer isn't that God is not powerful over evil, but that his actions, even those involving adversity, manifest different aspects of his perfection, either his mercy and generosity or his justice and wisdom. On the one hand, there's God's mercy and generosity. Even within hardship, the source suggests God cares for his creation. He might use adversity to bring people closer to him, to test their faith for a greater reward, to prevent a worse harm, or to ultimately guide them towards eternal bliss. God's mercy indeed surpasses his wrath.
So hardship can be a means to a greater good, a manifestation of mercy in disguise, perhaps.
That's one perspective offered. On the other hand, there's justice and wisdom. Nothing happens except by the decree of God, and this includes the existence of evil and corruption. While God does not love corruption itself, he decrees it, according to this view, for wise purposes. One major purpose mentioned is to test us.
So life's misfortunes and challenges are fundamentally a test.
Yes, that's a central theme. Life is presented as a test that will reveal our deeds and our conduct. We are tested with hardships just as they may be tested with blessings. The outcomes of this test, based on our responses, lead ultimately to paradise or hellfire.
And how people react to the test reviews something.
Exactly. The source explains that patient believers often turn back to God during trials, and this becomes a manifestation of his mercy and compassion toward them, leading to forgiveness and reward. Conversely, those who are inclined towards disbelief or arrogance might increase in arrogance and disobedience when faced with hardship or even blessings, and this becomes a manifestation of God's wisdom and justice, setting the stage for their accountability on Judgment Day.
So the same event can serve different purposes depending on the person involved and their reaction.
That seems to be the idea. And the reward for patience is emphasized. Paradise is described by Prophet Muhammad as being so blissful that just one moment there will make a person forget every single misery they ever endured, no matter how severe. The Quran encourages patience, promising good tidings to those who endure trials like fear, hunger, loss of wealth or life, and say, indeed we belong to God, and indeed to him we will return.
This whole concept of life as a test, governed by divine decree, brings us squarely to the Islamic concept of predetermination, or qadar. It's the belief that all things that happen are decreed by God. The source outlines 4 key aspects of this belief.
Yes, those 4 aspects form the foundation of understanding qadar. First, God's eternal knowledge. He always knew everything that would happen in perfect detail before it happened. Second, the writing. God wrote down all the things that will happen in what's called a preserved tablet. Third, God's will. He wills to bring those things into existence at their appointed times according to his wisdom. And fourth, God's power creation. He has power to create everything that he knew, wrote, and willed.
Knowledge, writing, will, creation. Okay. But here's a perennial question. If everything is already known, written, willed, and created by God, do our choices actually matter? Where does human free will fit in? It feels like a paradox, predetermined yet responsible.
It's arguably the most discussed theological balancing act, and the source addresses it directly. It affirms that we are moral and willing agents, our decisions are real, and we experience ourselves making choices. However, our choices are not free from God's determining agency.
How can both be true?
The key insight offered is that God's sovereign will and power are considered compatible with the existence of human will and agency. If they weren't compatible, the source argues, there would be no meaning to reward or punishment. Why hold someone accountable for something they had absolutely no part in choosing?
Right. Accountability implies some level of agency.
So, the distinction drawn is this. It is we who decide to do our actions, although it is God who creates all of that, our actions and their consequences, in accordance with what he has already written. The Quran says, you do not will except that God wills. We feel the inclination, make the choice. God's will and his creative power brings the inclination, the action and its effects into reality. Both are affirmed.
So our will operates within God's overarching will and decree.
That's the understanding. The Prophet Muhammad himself used to pray to God to keep his heart firm on the faith, acknowledging that if God wills someone to go astray, no one can guide them, yet the person themselves is still considered responsible for their choices leading to that state. It's a nuanced relationship between divine sovereignty and human responsibility.
Which means, crucially, that predetermination cannot be used as an excuse for doing wrong or failing to do good.
Absolutely not. The source is very clear. Predetermination is not an excuse for anyone to leave good deeds or to sin. It uses the analogy of a farmer. A farmer will not use God's decree as an excuse to not plant the seeds. He knows that, according to the system God created, planting seeds is the cause that generally leads to the effect of getting fruits. He has to do his part.
Take the means, as they say.
Right. A true believer, therefore, strives to do good while having a good opinion of God and accepting that everything that happens by his decree. It's a combination of effort and trust. The famous saying attributed to the prophet, "Tie your camel and trust in God," perfectly captures this balance. Do your part, take precautions, make the effort, and then entrust the outcome to God's wisdom and decree.
Okay. But one final loop back to the problem of evil within this framework. If God decrees everything, including evil actions chosen by humans, why would he decree evil? Even if humans choose it, why does his decree allow or encompass it?
The answer provided circles back to the idea of manifesting his attributes. God decrees this for wise purposes to do with the manifestation of his perfect attributes, such as manifesting his perfect justice. God creates people who he knows will choose evil so that he may justly punish them in the hellfire, thereby demonstrating his justice against rebellion and corruption. And conversely, it's a manifestation of his mercy, love, and generosity that he creates people who he knows will choose to repent, believe, and do good, guiding them and destining them for the garden, thus demonstrating his attributes of forgiveness, guidance, and reward.
So the existence of both paths and people choosing them allows for the full spectrum of God's perfect attributes, justice, mercy, power, wisdom, etc., to be made manifest in creation and in the hereafter.
That is the theological understanding presented, yes. The Quran states that whoever God guides is guided, and whoever he sends astray are the losers, based on their own choices and rejection of guidance, implying a divine wisdom overseeing all outcomes.
This brings us full circle, then, to the ultimate question. Given all this, the creation, the test, the decree, the accountability, what is the fundamental reason we were created? If life is this relatively short test, what's the core purpose we're meant to fulfill?
According to Shining Pearls of Faith, drawing from the Quran, our life is indeed short, and we were created for the purpose of worshiping God. A key verse states, "And I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me."
Worship. What does worship mean in this context? Is it just rituals, prayers, fasting?
Those are certainly important parts of it, but the definition provided is broader and deeper. Worship, or ibadah, is defined as to humble yourself before God with utmost humility and love him with utmost love. It encompasses not only the specific rituals like prayers and supplications, but potentially all actions that are pleasing to God.
So living life in a way that aligns with God's guidance with humility and love for him.
Exactly. It's a holistic way of life centered on acknowledging the Creator and striving to please him in all aspects. This purpose, then, means consciously trying to increase in piety and good deeds.
And within this framework of worship, what's considered the absolute gravest sin?
That would be shirk, the act of making partners with God in worship, associating others with God in his divinity or his right to be worshipped. This is considered the one unforgivable sin if a person dies in that state without repenting, as it fundamentally undermines the core principle of God's absolute oneness and perfection that we've discussed. The Quran warns that whoever commits shirk, God has forbidden paradise for them, and their refuge is the fire.
So avoiding shirk and fulfilling the purpose of worship, what is the ultimate goal, the prize for a believer?
The ultimate goal is divine acceptance, to be accepted by God and admitted to his garden paradise. This is described as the ultimate success. The descriptions of paradise in the Quran and prophetic traditions are extensive, promising eternal bliss, peace, and fulfillment beyond human imagination.
And is there something even beyond the physical or spiritual joys of paradise itself?
Yes, the source highlights, based on narrations from Prophet Muhammad, that the absolute greatest gift in paradise is to see God, our Creator. There's a description where, after the inhabitants of paradise have received all of their blessings, God will then lift the veil, and they will feel that they have not been awarded anything dear to them than looking at their Lord. It's presented as the ultimate culmination, the most profound joy imaginable, a direct, unveiled experience of the divine.
Wow. What an incredible and comprehensive journey we've just taken through these ideas. We started with that concept of an innate belief, possibly hardwired within us. We moved through understanding creation not just as out of nothing, but also as profound transformation. We looked at the signs of intricate design in the world around us.
Then the continuous dependence of everything on the Creator moment by moment.
Right. And then we delved into those profound attributes of God's perfection, solidifying why, logically, there can only be one such being. We tackled some really common and sometimes tricky objections.
Addressing things like omnipotence, the who created God question, time and space.
Exactly. And then we explored the wisdom potentially behind adversity and suffering, the nature of predestination and free will, and finally arrived at this ultimate purpose woven into our very existence, the call to worship and the hope of paradise.
This deep dive into the arguments presented in Shining Pearls of Faith really does lay out a coherent, very logical, and I think deeply purposeful view of existence. It offers these rational proofs alongside profound insights that certainly challenge us to think.
Absolutely. And as you, our listeners, consider these comprehensive arguments, I mean, from the tiniest particle seemingly changing substance to the grand, intricate order of the entire cosmos, from the reality of our own will and choices to the potential wisdom behind suffering, what new questions does this understanding of a single, perfect, active, and purposeful creator ignite within you? How might reflecting on this shape your perspective on your own life's journey and your place within what this source presents as a divinely designed reality?
It's definitely food for thought. We really encourage you to mull over these ideas, maybe revisit some of the points, and continue your own exploration into the magnificent signs that, according to this perspective, are all around us and within us.